It was a Tuesday afternoon in July when my entire summer changed. I pulled into my driveway after a long day, groceries in the back seat, Sophia texting me about dinner, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that's supposed to mean nothing. And there it was, stapled directly to my pool fence. An orange notice, the size of a sheet of paper, bright enough to see from the street. I didn't even get out of the car right away. I just sat there, engine running, staring at it. $300 per week, effective immediately. No warning letter, no phone call, no courtesy knock on the door, just a number, a legal-sounding paragraph I'd never seen before, and a 10-day window to respond before the fine started compounding. The fence had been standing in that exact spot for 6 years. 6 years, and not a single word from anyone. I could have paid it, written the check, replaced the fence, moved on with my life. That would have been the easy thing. But I kept thinking about one question I couldn't shake. Why now? Why, after 6 years of silence, did Margaret Chen suddenly need my fence gone? That question was worth more than $300 a week. And the answer, the real answer, changed everything. My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm a high school history teacher. I coach junior varsity soccer in the fall. I grade papers on Sunday mornings, and I have strong opinions about cast iron pans that my daughter finds embarrassing. I'm not a fighter. I want to be clear about that up front. I'm the kind of person who avoids conflict in the grocery store, who'll let someone cut in line rather than say anything. My ex-wife Priya would tell you that's one of my less useful qualities, but I am someone who pays attention. 44 years of living will do that. You start to notice when something doesn't add up. I bought this house 8 years ago. It was the first property I ever owned, and I remember standing in the empty living room the day I got the keys, just listening to the quiet, thinking, this is mine. Not rented, not borrowed, mine. 2 years in, I had the pool put in. My dad flew out from Tucson for the weekend to help me plan it, where the fence would go, how wide the gate should be, where to face the chairs so you catch the evening light. He passed away 14 months later. So when I say this property means something to me, I mean it in a way that doesn't fully fit into words. This isn't just a house. This is the last place my father and I built something together. And Margaret Chen was trying to take a piece of it. So she needed a very good reason. She didn't have one. I drove to the HOA management office the next morning with a folder under my arm. Inside that folder was everything I thought I needed. The original approval form for my pool fence, Form 14B, signed by the previous HOA president, stamped, notarized, dated 6 years ago. I had the permit from the city. I had the contractor's completion certificate. I had every piece of paper that said, in clear language, this fence was built legally, approved properly, and has been standing without objection ever since. I was calm. I was prepared. I genuinely believed that once I put those documents on the table, the conversation would last about 10 minutes. I had never been more wrong about anything in my life. The office was in the community clubhouse, a beige building near the main entrance with a small HOA logo on the door and a fake ficus in the corner that nobody had dusted in what looked like several years. A woman at the front desk told me Margaret Chen was expecting me and pointed me toward a conference room at the back. Margaret was already seated when I walked in. She had a legal pad, a pen lined up perfectly beside it, and a smile that said she had done this before. Gerald Foss, the HOA vice president, sat 2 chairs down with a binder in front of him and the expression of a man who was there to take notes and absolutely nothing else. Margaret stood and shook my hand. She was polished, soft-spoken. She used my first name immediately, the way people do when they've been trained to make you feel like they're on your side. She thanked me for coming in. She said she hoped we could resolve things quickly and amicably. She said the word amicably twice. I put my folder on the table and told her I had the original approval documentation for the fence. I told her that fence had been standing for 6 years without a single complaint, and I wanted to understand what had changed. She nodded. She looked at my documents. She did not pick them up. Then she said, very gently, that she understood my frustration. I told her I wasn't frustrated. I was confused. There's a difference. She slid a printed document across the table toward me. It was the revised architectural guidelines, updated 7 months ago, she explained, to bring Sycamore Ridge in line with current community standards. I flipped through it. Pool fencing, Section 9. 3 compliance requirements, all new. First colour. Approved finishes were bronze or matte black only. My fence was silver aluminum. Wrong colour. Second, post height. Maximum 48 inches for residential pool enclosures. My posts were 52 inches. Wrong height. Third, gate latch mechanism. Self-closing, self-latching, key lockable on the exterior side. My gate latched from the inside. Wrong mechanism. I looked up from the document and asked her why I hadn't been notified when these guidelines were revised. I had lived in this community for 8 years. My fence had been approved by this HOA. If the rules changed, shouldn't someone have told me directly? Margaret said that notification had been handled per bylaw requirements. I asked what that meant. She said a notice was posted on the community bulletin board at the main entrance gate. I want you to let that sit for a moment. A single flyer. On a bulletin board, at the entrance gate of an 847 household community. That was the notification. That was how they told nearly 1,000 families that the rules had changed and their existing structures might now be violations. I asked when the guidelines were revised. She said at a special session meeting 7 months prior. I asked how many residents attended. She looked at her legal pad. She said it was a properly noticed meeting and that the board had followed all required procedures. I asked again, how many residents attended? Gerald Foss wrote something in his binder. Margaret said attendance had been adequate for quorum purposes. I told her I wanted a copy of those meeting minutes. She said she'd have them sent to me by end of week. Then she explained what came next. The $300 weekly fine would continue to accumulate until the fence was brought into compliance. I had the option to replace the fence with a compliant alternative within 60 days, at which point accrued fines would be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. She used the phrase case-by-case basis the way people use it when they want you to think they're being generous. I asked if she had a list of approved vendors for compliant fencing. She did. It was right there in the guidelines appendix. 3 companies: Sunstate Fencing, Desert Edge Barriers, and Premier Pool Enclosures. She said all 3 had been vetted by the board and could provide compliant installations at competitive prices. I wrote down all 3 names. I thanked Margaret for her time. She stood, shook my hand again, said she hoped we could put this behind us quickly. Said the word amicably one more time. I picked up my folder, my stamped, notarized, 6-year-old approved fence documentation that she had never once picked up off the table, and I walked out. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes without starting the engine. My phone buzzed. Sophia. She wanted to know if we were still doing pool day Saturday. I texted back yes. Then I opened my glove compartment and found a pen. On the back of the fine notice, I wrote 3 names: Sunstate Fencing, Desert Edge Barriers, Premier Pool Enclosures. I didn't know yet what I was going to find, but something about the way Margaret had slid that appendix across the table, smooth, practiced, ready, told me those names mattered. I started the car and drove home to find out why. That night, after Sophia went to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table with 2 documents side by side. On my left, the original CC&Rs. The covenants, conditions and restrictions for Sycamore Ridge, the founding legal document of the entire HOA, the thing every homeowner signs when they move in, the document that is supposed to govern everything the board can and cannot do. I had never read it all the way through. Most people don't. That's what people like Margaret count on. On my right, the revised architectural guidelines, the document she had slid across the table with that practiced smile. I made a pot of coffee. I started reading. It took me 2 evenings. Not because the documents were long, though they were, but because I kept stopping, kept going back, kept reading a sentence in the CC&Rs, and then flipping to the guidelines and reading it again. Article 7, Section 3 of the original CC&Rs was the one that stopped me cold. It said that any revision to the architectural guidelines required a 30-day public comment period during which all affected homeowners could submit written responses to the proposed changes. It said that a special session meeting called to adopt binding changes required a minimum of 15 members present to constitute a valid quorum. And it said that all proposed revisions had to be mailed, not posted on a bulletin board, mailed to every household on record at least 21 days before the vote, 30-day comment period, 15-member quorum, mailed notice to every household. Margaret had done none of those things. 6 people attended that special session. 6. I didn't have the minutes yet, she still hadn't sent them, but she had admitted it herself when I pushed her. Adequate for quorum purposes, she said. 6 people out of 847 households voted to change the rules for everyone. And nobody was mailed anything. The revision wasn't just aggressive. Under the HOA's own founding document, it was void. But I kept going, because I still had those 3 names written on the back of my fine notice, Sun State Fencing LLC. I searched the Arizona Corporation Commission database, public record, anyone can access it. The registered agent for Sun State Fencing LLC was listed as Raymond Chen. I sat back in my chair. I searched Raymond Chen, Arizona. LinkedIn profile, Raymond Chen, owner of Sun State Fencing LLC, formerly with Chen Meridian Property Development. I searched Chen Meridian Property Development. I found an old Phoenix Business Journal article from 4 years ago, a development project, a ribbon cutting, a quote from a company spokesperson, and in the 3rd paragraph, a reference to the project's community liaison, Margaret Chen, then consultant, Chen Meridian Property Development, Sun State Fencing, the first name on the approved vendor list, owned by Margaret's son. I moved to the second name, Desert Edge Barriers. Same database. The registered business address was a suite number on East Camelback Road. I searched that address. It matched a registered office address that appeared in 2 other corporate filings, both connected to a holding company that listed Chen Meridian as a predecessor entity. Third name, Premier Pool Enclosures. Smaller operation, harder to trace, but I found 1 public review. A single Yelp review posted 14 months ago, 5 stars. Reviewer named G. Foss, Gerald Foss, HOA Vice President, the man who sat in that conference room with his binder, writing things down and saying nothing. I put the pen down. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Margaret hadn't just changed the rules to force compliance. She had changed the rules to force residents to hire specific companies connected to her family and her VP. Every fence that came down in Sycamore Ridge under her new guidelines was a potential customer for her son's business. This wasn't bureaucracy. This was a scheme. I should have slept on it. Instead, I sat there running the numbers. $300 a week, 60 days to comply. If I fought it and lost, I was looking at over $2,000 in fines before the deadline, more after, and that assumed she didn't add anything else. She added something else. 2 days later, a second violation notice arrived. My garden shed, built the same year as the fence, approved through the same process with the same Form 14B paperwork, was now cited for non-compliance. Roof colour. The guidelines now required a specific shade of weathered grey for all outbuildings. My shed was brown. 4 days after that, a third notice. A crack in my driveway sealant, cited as an aesthetic violation under the revised maintenance standards. A crack. In my driveway, 3 violations, 3 separate weekly fines, all within 10 days of my visit to her office. I called Priya that night, not because I needed permission. We'd been divorced for 4 years and we co-parented well, which meant we stayed in each other's lives enough to talk when things mattered. I told her what was happening. I told her about the vendor connections. I told her about the quorum failure. She listened. Then she said, "Daniel, please don't let this become something that costs us Sophia's college fund." I told her it wouldn't. I told her I just needed to understand what I was dealing with before I decided anything. What I didn't tell her was that I was already decided. I just didn't have the words for it yet. The next morning, I walked over to my neighbor Bet Nakamura's house. Bet was 68 years old, retired, and had lived in Sycamore Ridge for 11 years, longer than anyone else on our cul-de-sac. She grew up in a family of librarians, she always said, which meant she grew up in a family of people who believed that keeping records was a form of power. She proved it when she answered the door. I hadn't even finished explaining what was happening before she held up one hand, disappeared inside, and came back with a shoebox. It was stuffed. HOA notices, meeting minutes, printed emails from the board going back 3 years. She had kept everything, organized by date, in a system that would have impressed my most detail-oriented students. She sat me down at her kitchen table and started pulling things out. She had received 3 violation notices herself, all within 2 weeks of voting against one of Margaret's budget proposals at last year's annual meeting. The violations were minor, vague, eventually dropped without explanation. But the timing, she said, was not a coincidence. She'd always known it. She just didn't know what to do with the knowledge. Then she pulled out one more document. It was the attendance sheet from the special session meeting, the one where the revised guidelines were adopted. Margaret's own handwriting at the top, date, location, purpose of meeting, and below it 6 signatures, 6 names, out of 847 households, and at the bottom, confirming the record as accurate, Margaret Chen's signature. She had signed a document proving her own procedural violation. She had filed it in the HOA records, and Beta Nakamura had a copy because Beta Nakamura had copies of everything. I held that sheet of paper and felt something shift in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something steadier than anger. The feeling you get when a thing that seemed complicated suddenly becomes very, very simple. I looked at Bet. She looked at me. She said, "I've been waiting for someone to do something with that for 7 months. I told her I was going to need her help. She put the shoebox on the table between us and said, I was hoping you'd say that. That night, I went home and wrote one word at the top of a fresh page on my legal pad. Attorney. The fence could wait. Margaret could stack her notices. Gerald Foss could fill his binder. I had the attendance sheet. I had the vendor connections. I had Bet's shoebox and 11 years of careful records. And for the first time since that orange notice appeared on my fence, I wasn't playing defence anymore. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday morning. I know it was Thursday because I had a free period first thing, and I was sitting at my kitchen table grading papers when the mail carrier knocked instead of just dropping things in the slot. That only happens with certified mail. The kind that requires a signature, the kind someone sends when they want you to know they mean it. The return address was Carver and Hollis, attorneys at law, Phoenix, Arizona. I signed for it. I set it on the table next to my coffee. I finished grading the paper I was on, a student essay about the causes of World War I, which felt appropriate, and then I opened it. It was 2 pages. Dense, formal, the kind of language designed to feel like a wall. The letter informed me that I was in violation of Sycamore Ridge HOA architectural guidelines, that my accrued fines were a legitimate financial obligation enforceable under Arizona law. That failure to pay or remediate within the specified window could result in the HOA placing a lien on my property. And then, buried in the second paragraph of the second page, one more line. It noted that under certain conditions, Arizona law permits an HOA to initiate foreclosure proceedings on an unresolved lien. Foreclosure, that word, in that letter about my fence. I read that paragraph 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it, because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what they were doing. They weren't necessarily planning to foreclose on my house over a pool fence. They probably couldn't, and they likely knew that. But they wanted me to read that word in an official letter from a law firm and feel my stomach drop. It worked. For about 30 seconds it worked. Then I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and added it to my folder. Evidence is evidence, regardless of who produces it. While I was dealing with the letter, something else was happening in the neighborhood that I didn't find out about until later. Gerald Foss had been making appearances. Not official ones, casual ones. At the mailboxes in the evening. At the community pool on weekends. At the little cluster of benches near the entrance where a few of the older residents liked to sit in the mornings. Just showing up, chatting, mentioning in the course of conversation that there were some code enforcement issues being addressed in the cul-de-sac, that one homeowner in particular was making things complicated for the board, that it was a shame when people chose conflict over community. He never said my name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew which cul-de-sac. Everyone knew which homeowner. My neighbour across the street, a quiet man named Paul who I'd waved to for 8 years without ever having a real conversation, stopped me one morning while I was getting my mail. He looked uncomfortable. He said he'd heard things were getting complicated with the HOA. He said, and I could tell he genuinely meant this kindly, that sometimes it was just easier to make the change and move on. That it wasn't worth the stress. I thanked him. I told him I understood. I didn't tell him what I'd found in the corporate records or what was on that attendance sheet or what the letter from Carver and Hollis said on its second page. 2 days later, another neighbour, a woman named Diane, who sometimes watched my trash bins when I travelled, came to my door and said almost exactly the same thing. Word for word, almost. "Just replace the fence, Daniel. It's not worth it." That's when I understood that Gerald Foss's casual conversations weren't casual at all. They were coordinated. Margaret was using him to apply social pressure, while the law firm applied legal pressure. 2 tracks, same destination, make Daniel Reyes feel isolated enough, stressed enough, and embarrassed enough to write a check to her son's fencing company and disappear. I almost missed the most important conversation of that entire week because I was so focused on my own situation. Marcus Webb had been my neighbour for 3 years. He lived 2 houses down, ran his own contracting business, and was the kind of person who fixed things without being asked, patched a section of the community fence one afternoon just because it needed doing, never mentioned it to anyone. We'd had beers on his porch a handful of times. He was steady, practical, not someone who dramatised things. He knocked on my door on a Saturday afternoon, looked both ways like he was checking for something, and came inside without much preamble. He told me that about 14 months ago he had renovated his back patio. He pulled permits, did the work properly, used his own materials and his own crew. A few weeks after he finished, he got a violation notice. Patio cover height, non-compliant colour, improper post anchoring, 3 citations, just like me, all arriving within the same 2-week window. He started to fight it, started pulling his own permits to verify compliance. Then a funny thing happened. One of Margaret's approved vendors, Sun State Fencing, contacted him out of nowhere. Said they were in the neighbourhood doing an assessment and noticed his property. Said they could handle some fencing work on his front yard that would, quote, demonstrate good faith to the board. Marcus hired them for a small front yard job. Nothing major. A few $100s of work he didn't really need. His 3 violation notices disappeared the following week. No resolution letter. No explanation. Just gone. He looked at me across my kitchen table and said, "I didn't understand what had happened until you sent that email on the community listserv." He meant the email I had sent 2 days earlier, a straightforward summary of what I'd found. The quorum failure, the vendor connections, the corporate registration showing Raymond Chen as owner of Sun State Fencing. No accusations, just documentation, dates, names, public records. I had sent it through the community listserv that all residents had access to. I thought it was the most direct way to share what I'd found with my neighbours. Within 48 hours, Margaret had revoked listserv access for all non-board members. The official reason, sent in a board email, was to prevent the spread of misinformation and protect community harmony. The timing, 48 hours after my message, protected nothing except her own exposure. She sent a follow-up board email the next day. It called my claims misinformed. It said the vendor approval process was conducted with full transparency. It said the board was committed to consistent enforcement of community standards and would not be deterred by bad faith challenges from individual homeowners. Bad faith. That phrase in a board communication sent to every household in Sycamore Ridge. I printed it, added it to the folder. Here is what I had now: a law firm sending foreclosure-adjacent threats over a fence. A vice president running a quiet influence campaign through the neighbourhood. A listserv access revoked within 2 days of factual information being shared. A board email calling documented public records misinformation. And a neighbour who watched his legitimate violation notices vanish the week he paid Margaret's son's company for work he didn't need. The pressure was real. I won't pretend it wasn't. There were nights that week where I lay awake running numbers, fines, legal costs, the timeline, Priya's voice saying Sophia's college fund is not to be touched. But here is what I kept coming back to. If Margaret had a legitimate case, she didn't need a law firm to mention foreclosure in the second paragraph. She didn't need Gerald Foss whispering in people's ears at the mailboxes. She didn't need to shut down the listserv 48 hours after I shared public records on it. Legitimate authority doesn't behave like that. Cornered authority does. That Saturday, Bet Nakamura came over with her shoebox again. This time she also brought her laptop, a pot of tea, and a name. She said her niece had used an HOA attorney in Scottsdale for a dispute 2 years ago. She said the attorney was sharp, knew Arizona HOA law specifically, and had a reputation for not being impressed by letters from firms like Carver and Hollis. The attorney's name was Carmen Voss. I wrote it down. Monday morning, first thing, I called her office. Carmen Voss's office was small, deliberately unintimidating and covered in paper. Not messy paper, organized paper. Stacks with labels, folders with tabs, a whiteboard on the wall behind her desk with a timeline on it that belonged to someone else's case. She was in her mid-50s, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and when I walked in and put my folder on her desk, she didn't shake my hand first. She just opened the folder and started reading. I liked her immediately. I sat across from her while she went through everything. The original Form 14B approval, the revised guidelines, the quorum attendance sheet in Margaret's handwriting, the corporate registration showing Raymond Chen as owner of Sun State Fencing, the Carver and Hollis letter, the board email calling my documented research misinformation. She read without interrupting me. When she finished, she took off her glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "This is not a fence dispute." I told her I knew. She said, "Good, because I need you to understand that going in, because what we're about to do is significantly larger than getting your fines voided." She started with the legal foundation. The guideline revision, she confirmed, was procedurally void. Not aggressive, not questionable, void. The CC&Rs were unambiguous, 30-day comment period, mailed notice to all households, 15-member quorum. None of those conditions had been met. A revision adopted without following the HOA's own procedural requirements had no legal standing. The fines built on that revision were therefore unenforceable as written. That was the baseline. That was the floor. But Carmen was already looking at the ceiling. She pulled out a notepad and wrote 3 letters at the top. ARS Arizona Revised Statutes, she explained. Specifically Statute 33, 1803. Selective and retaliatory enforcement of HOA rules. Under Arizona law, an HOA cannot enforce rules against specific homeowners while ignoring the same violations in others. And it absolutely cannot issue violations as retaliation for a homeowner exercising their legal rights, including the right to question the board, share public information with neighbors, or challenge enforcement actions. She tapped the board email on her desk. The one calling my listserv message misinformation. She said, "They put the retaliation in writing." That's either very bold or very stupid. In my experience, it's usually both. She filed a public records request the following week for all HOA fine records covering the previous 24 months. Under Arizona law, HOA financial records and enforcement histories are accessible to members upon request. The board had 15 business days to respond. They responded on day 14 with a file that I suspect they hoped was too large and too disorganized to be useful. Carmen had it organized within 3 days. The numbers were stark. Over 24 months, 11 households in Sycamore Ridge had received formal violation notices. When Carmen cross-referenced those 11 households against the HOA meeting minutes, which were also public record, a pattern emerged that was almost too clean to believe. 9 of the 11 households had done at least one of 3 things: voted against a Margaret Chen budget proposal, spoken during public comment at a board meeting in opposition to a board action, or declined to use an approved vendor after receiving a recommendation from the board. 2 of the 11 households had not done any of those things. Those 2 cases appeared to be genuine compliance issues, the kind that happen in any neighborhood, actual violations addressed and resolved without escalation. The other 9 were a list of people who had, in some way, said no to Margaret Chen. 2 of those 9 households had paid thousands in fines and used Sun State Fencing, Raymond Chen's company, to remediate their violations. Marcus Webb's experience wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern with a price tag attached. And then there were the Garcias. Eduardo and Miriam Garcia, retired couple, had lived in Sycamore Ridge for 6 years before the fines started. Their first notice arrived 11 months ago, 3 weeks after Eduardo Garcia spoke at a board meeting questioning the budget allocation for landscaping, a line item that had nearly doubled without explanation. 8 months, $6,400 in accumulated fines, notices for their fence, their window trim color, their garage door, their decorative mailbox post. One thing after another, week after week, while they tried to fight it and got nowhere. They sold their home 8 months after the first notice, left the community entirely. I read their record twice. A retired couple pushed out of their home by a sustained campaign of fabricated violations because one of them asked a question at a board meeting. I sat with that for a long time. The major revelation came from Carmen, not from me. While I had been focused on the vendor connections, Raymond Chen, Sun State Fencing, the corporate registrations, Carmen had been looking at the law firm, Carver and Hollis, the firm that sent me the foreclosure-adjacent letter, the HOA's retained legal counsel. In Arizona, attorneys and law firms are required to disclose certain business relationships that could represent conflicts of interest. Carmen filed a query through the state bar and found a disclosed relationship between a senior partner at Carver and Hollis and a property development holding company. The holding company had a listed predecessor entity, Chen Meridian Property Development, Margaret's former employer. The company her son Raymond had also worked for before launching Sun State Fencing. Carmen laid it out for me on the whiteboard in her office. Margaret Chen runs the HOA. Her son Raymond owns Sun State Fencing, an approved vendor. The HOA's law firm has a business relationship with a holding company connected to Margaret's development network. Fines are issued to residents who resist. Residents are directed to approved vendors to resolve violations. Money flows toward a connected ecosystem, and residents who ask questions are systematically pressured until they either comply or leave. She drew a circle around the whole thing and said, "This is not an HOA president with a strict interpretation of community standards. This is an organized extraction scheme operating inside a residential association." I looked at the whiteboard for a long moment. I thought about the Garcias, $6,400 and a house they loved, gone. I thought about Bet, sitting on that attendance sheet for 7 months because she didn't know what to do with it. I thought about Marcus, hiring a fencing company for a job he didn't need because it was cheaper than fighting. I thought about Eduardo Garcia standing up at a board meeting to ask a question about a landscaping budget and having his home turned into a target because of it. Carmen filed the cease and desist letter to the HOA board that afternoon. It outlined the procedural void, the selective enforcement pattern, the retaliatory timeline, and the vendor relationships. It notified Carver and Hollis that a complaint was being prepared for the Arizona Department of Real Estate regarding HOA management conduct. That evening I built a simple document page, nothing elaborate, just a clean, organized summary. The timeline, the attendance sheet scanned, the corporate registrations, the fine records with the pattern highlighted, the board email, all of it sourced, labeled, and dated. I printed the link on note cards and put one in every mailbox I could reach on foot that evening. 43 houses. By the following morning, 14 households had emailed me. 3 days after that, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered it. Gerald Foss. His voice was different from the conference room, quieter, less certain. He said he was calling informally, not on behalf of the board, just to see if there was any possibility of sitting down and discussing a resolution. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then I took a photo of the number on my screen, forwarded the details to Carmen with a single line of context, and did not call him back. Carmen's response came 4 minutes later. It said, "Perfect. Don't respond. We're ready." The quarterly HOA meeting was scheduled for the 3rd Tuesday of the month. Margaret could not cancel it. Under the Sycamore Ridge bylaws, a regularly scheduled quarterly meeting required 60 days written notice to all households before it could be legally postponed. She didn't have 60 days. She had 11, and cancelling it on short notice, with a state inquiry now open and a cease and desist letter sitting on the board's desk, would have looked exactly like what it was, a board running from its own membership. So the meeting stayed on the calendar. Carmen advised me to attend, speak during public comment, and present my evidence directly to the community. Not argue, not accuse. Present. Let the documents speak and let the room draw its own conclusions. She would be there, seated at the back, available if anything crossed a legal line. I spent the weekend before preparing, not rehearsing speeches, organising documents. the attendance sheet, the corporate registrations, the fine record pattern, the Garcia statement, which Carmen had obtained and formatted as a proper sworn declaration, one page of the board's own email, printed and highlighted in a single place. I kept thinking about something I tell my students at the start of every school year. Primary sources, I always say, are the most powerful thing in a historian's toolkit. Not what someone said happened, what the document actually says, the date on the page, the signature at the bottom, the number in the column. I had primary sources. I had Margaret's own signature on an attendance sheet that proved her own procedural violation. There was nothing to argue about. There was only something to show. The community room held about 80 people comfortably. When I arrived 20 minutes early, it was already half full. By the time Margaret called the meeting to order, there were people standing along the back wall and sitting on the floor near the side exit. I counted over 60 residents. For a quarterly HOA meeting in a community that typically drew 8 to 12 people, it was extraordinary. Margaret saw the room when she walked in. I watched her take it in for exactly 1 second before her expression reset to its usual composed neutral. She set her laminated agenda on the table, adjusted her pen beside it, and sat down. Gerald Foss sat 2 chairs away from her instead of immediately beside her. I noticed that. I think other people noticed it too. She opened with procedural items: approval of previous meeting minutes, treasurer's report, landscaping contract renewal. She moved through the agenda with the focused efficiency of someone who wanted to reach adjournment as quickly as possible. Every item was handled briskly. No discussion invited, none permitted for long when offered. When she reached public comment, she paused for exactly 1 beat, then announced it would be limited to 2 minutes per speaker. I was already walking to the microphone. I set my folder on the small podium beside the microphone and looked out at the room. 60-something faces. Neighbours I'd waved to for years. People I'd never spoken to. A few I recognised from the emails they'd sent me after I distributed the document link. I didn't begin with my fence. I began with a question. I asked how many people in this room knew that the architectural guidelines were revised 7 months ago. About a third of the hands went up. Uncertain hands, most of them. The kind that go up halfway and then look around. I asked how many people received a mailed notice about that revision before it was voted on. No hands. I said, according to Article 7, Section 3 of our CC&Rs, a mailed notice to every household was required before that vote could legally take place, along with a 30-day public comment period and a minimum of 15 members present to constitute a valid quorum. I held up the attendance sheet. I said, this is the attendance record from that special session meeting. It is in the handwriting of our HOA president, and it bears her signature at the bottom confirming its accuracy. 6 names are on this list. 6 residents out of 847 households voted to change the architectural rules for this entire community. The quorum requirement was 15. This meeting did not have a quorum. Under our own governing documents, the revision it produced is void. The room was very quiet. I set the attendance sheet down and picked up the corporate registration documents. I said, the revised guidelines direct residents to 3 approved vendors for pool fencing. I looked into those vendors. Sun State Fencing LLC's registered agent is Raymond Chen. Raymond Chen is the son of our current HOA president. Desert Edge Barriers shares a registered address with a holding company connected to a development firm that Margaret Chen formerly worked for. Premier Pool Enclosures has 1 public review, left by Gerald Foss, our vice president. I did not editorialize. I just read the documents. Then I said, I have also obtained the HOA's fine records for the past 24 months. Of the 11 households that received violation notices in that period, 9 had previously voted against a board proposal, spoken in opposition at a meeting, or declined to use a board-recommended vendor. I am happy to share that full record with anyone who wants it after this meeting. I looked toward the back of the room where Carmen was seated. She gave me a single small nod. I said, a formal complaint has been filed with the Arizona Department of Real Estate. That inquiry is currently open. I am not here tonight to attack anyone. I am here because this is my community too, and I believe everyone in this room deserves to know what has been done in our name. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I picked up my folder and walked back to my seat. The room did not stay quiet for long. A woman in the 3rd row stood up without going to the microphone. She said her name was Patricia Odoms and she had received a violation notice 8 months ago for her pool enclosure. She had used Sun State fencing to resolve it. She said she had no idea the company belonged to the board president's son. Her voice was steady but her hands were not. Margaret said from the table that the documents being presented had not been verified by the board and that residents should be cautious about misinformation. A man near the side wall said, "Those are public records. You can look them up yourself. Which ones aren't verified?" Margaret said the board would review all concerns through proper channels. The man said, "What channels?" "You shut down the listserv." Someone else said, "I got a notice too, right after I voted no on the reserve fund proposal." Another voice, same. 3 notices in 2 weeks. A woman near the front, who I later learned had served on the original architectural committee, stood and said clearly and on the record that the special session meeting had been scheduled with less than 48 hours' notice and that she had not been informed of it despite being an active committee member. She said she had assumed it was a scheduling error. She understood now that it was not. Margaret moved to adjourn. 3 board members voted with her. 2 abstained. They did not vote to adjourn. They simply sat with their hands in their laps and looked at the table. The meeting ended. Technically, legally. Margaret gathered her laminated agenda, said something to Gerald Foss in a low voice, and walked toward the exit. Gerald Foss did not follow her immediately. He stood for a moment, looked at the room, then packed his binder slowly and left alone. The community room did not empty. People stayed, stood in clusters, exchanged phone numbers. A woman I'd never met pressed a manila folder into my hands, more violation notices, hers and her neighbours, dates and amounts written in careful pencil on a sticky note on the front. An older man pulled me aside and said he'd been on the original HOA board before Margaret's election and that he had questions about the reserve fund that nobody had ever answered for him. Bet found me near the door. She didn't say anything. She just squeezed my arm once and nodded. I drove home with the manila folder on the passenger seat. I thought about what Carmen had said before the meeting, when I asked her what we were actually hoping to accomplish in that room tonight. "We're not going to win anything tonight," she said, "but we're going to make it impossible for her to pretend this is just one difficult homeowner with a grudge. After tonight, it's a community." She was right. That's exactly what happened. Margaret still controlled the board. The fines were still technically on the books. The state inquiry was still just an inquiry. Nothing had been resolved. But 60 people had seen the attendance sheet. 60 people had heard Patricia Odoms say she hadn't known whose company she was hiring. 60 people had watched 2 board members keep their hands in their laps when Margaret called for adjournment. The meeting hadn't ended her, but it had cracked something that was not going to seal back up. I got home, put the folder on the kitchen table next to the others, and called Carmen. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "What's next?" She said, "Now we finish it." 3 things happened in the 10 days after the community meeting, and they happened fast. The first, the Arizona Department of Real Estate upgraded its inquiry into Sycamore Ridge HOA management from preliminary review to formal investigation. Carmen got the notification on a Wednesday morning and called me before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. A formal investigation meant subpoena authority. It meant document production requirements. It meant that whatever Margaret had been keeping in her files, she could no longer choose whether to share it. The second, Carver and Hollis withdrew from representing the HOA. No dramatic announcement, a single letter to the board, copied to Carmen, citing an internal conflict review and wishing the board well in securing alternative counsel. Carmen read it to me over the phone in a tone that suggested she was not surprised. "When a law firm quietly exits a case it has been aggressively pursuing," she explained, "it usually means their own exposure has become a more pressing concern than their clients'." The third, 2 board members contacted Carmen privately. Not together, separately, within 4 days of each other. Both said the same thing in different words, that they had not fully understood the legal exposure the board was carrying, that they had deferred to Margaret's judgment on procedural matters and now understood that had been a mistake, and that they were prepared to cooperate with the investigation if it came to that. Carmen told them to get their own attorneys. Then she told me that when board members start seeking personal legal separation from a board president, the board president's position has become indefensible. Margaret's response to all of this was to file a counter-complaint against me. harassment, defamation, intentional interference with HOA governance. The complaint was filed through the HOA's newly retained counsel, a solo practitioner named Dennis Albright, who, Carmen noted, had no discernible HOA law experience on his public profile and appeared to have been retained quickly and cheaply. The complaint cited my document website, my neighbourhood outreach, my public comment at the meeting, and my distribution of the corporate registration records as a coordinated campaign of harassment against a volunteer community leader. Carmen responded with a 4-page letter that I was not allowed to read in full because she said it would make me feel too good too early and she needed me focused. What she told me was that the complaint had no viable legal basis, that every action I had taken was protected either by Arizona HOA member rights statutes or basic First Amendment grounds, and that filing it had been Margaret's first genuinely unforced error, because it demonstrated consciousness of guilt more clearly than anything I could have presented at the community meeting. She filed it as an exhibit in our civil case. Carmen had been quietly building toward the special membership meeting for 3 weeks. Under the Sycamore Ridge bylaws, a special membership meeting could be called by resident petition if signatures were gathered from at least 10% of households. 847 households. 85 signatures required. We had 112. The petition was filed on a Monday. Under the bylaws, the board had 21 days to schedule the meeting. They scheduled it for day 20, a Thursday evening, in the same community room where the quarterly meeting had cracked Margaret's authority in public for the first time. The agenda had 2 items. First, a motion to rescind the architectural guideline revisions adopted at the special session meeting held 7 months prior. Second, a vote of no confidence in the current HOA board. Carmen spent the 2 weeks before the meeting preparing for it like a trial, because in every way that mattered, it was won. She coordinated sworn declarations from the Garcia family, Eduardo and Miriam, who agreed to participate by video from the home they had retreated to after leaving Sycamore Ridge. Eduardo's statement was 2 pages. He read it himself quietly without drama, and it was more devastating for that. A retired man describing, month by month, what it had felt like to watch his home become a target. The notices, the fines, the calls to the HOA office that went unreturned. The morning he and Miriam sat at their kitchen table and agreed they were too tired to keep fighting. $6,400, and a house they had loved for 6 years. Marcus Webb prepared a written statement and agreed to deliver it in person. Beta Nakamura would present the attendance sheet herself. Carmen felt it carried more weight coming from the woman who had quietly preserved it for 7 months than from an attorney citing it as an exhibit. The homeowner who had served on the original architectural committee, a man named Robert Tsai, agreed to testify about the special session notice he never received despite being an active committee member, and Patricia Odoms, the woman who stood up in the quarterly meeting without going to the microphone, agreed to speak about her experience hiring Sunstate Fencing without knowing whose company it was. Carmen told me I would speak last before she made the closing legal summary. She said, "You are not the star witness. You are the through line. Let the others establish the pattern. You establish what it cost." The community room was standing room only again. More people this time. I counted closer to 80 before I stopped counting. People who hadn't been at the quarterly meeting. People who had received the document link and passed it to someone else. A woman near the front who told me before it started that she had moved into the community 4 months ago, had already received 1 violation notice and had driven past the Sunstate Fencing yard on her way here tonight. Margaret was at the board table, composed as always. Laminated agenda, pen lined up beside it, the full performance of orderly authority. Dennis Albright, her new attorney, sat in a chair along the wall with a legal pad. Gerald Foss was in the audience. Not at the board table. In the audience 3 rows back, alone, Carmen opened. She did not raise her voice once in the entire presentation. She laid out the procedural void first, CC&R requirements, the quorum failure, the absence of mailed notice, and she did it in plain language that required no legal background to follow. She showed the attendance sheet on a projected display. 6 names. Margaret's signature. 15 required. She let the room sit with that for a moment before moving on. Then she presented the fine records. The pattern rendered visually a simple chart, 11 households, 9 of them with a documented prior conflict with the board. She did not call it a scheme. She presented the data and let the room name it for themselves. Then the witnesses. The Garcia video played on a laptop screen angled toward the room. Eduardo Garcia, 67 years old, sitting at a kitchen table in a house that wasn't the one he'd chosen to retire in, reading 2 pages in a steady voice. When he finished, Miriam leaned into the frame briefly and said simply, "We just wanted to live there. That was all we wanted." Then the screen went dark. Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment. Marcus Webb was direct and specific. Dates, amounts, the phone call from Sunstate, the notices that disappeared. He said, "I'm not someone who makes accusations. I'm telling you what happened to me in sequence, and you can decide what it means." Bette Nakamura walked to the front of the room carrying the original attendance sheet in a plastic document sleeve. She explained where she had gotten it, how long she had kept it, and why. She said, "I kept it because I believed that one day someone would want to do something about it. I'm glad that day came before I stopped believing it would." Robert Sy confirmed the notice failure. Patricia Odoms described hiring Sunstate without knowing whose company it was, and then said something that nobody had scripted. She said she felt used. Not just financially. Used. That the community she had chosen to live in had been turned into a mechanism to extract money from her without her understanding or consent. Then I spoke. I didn't bring notes. Carmen had suggested it, and I had agreed because what I wanted to say wasn't complicated enough to need them. I said, "I'm a history teacher. I spend my days trying to convince 17-year-olds that documents matter, that dates matter, that the gap between what someone says happened and what the record actually shows, that gap is where the truth lives." I said, 6 years ago I built a pool fence with my father. I had it approved through proper channels. I have the stamped, notarized paperwork. 7 months ago, someone decided that paperwork meant nothing, that a revision adopted by 6 people without proper notice or quorum could erase 6 years of documented approval. And when I asked why, I got a law firm letter mentioning foreclosure. I said, "I want to be clear about what I am asking this community to do tonight. I am not asking you to punish anyone. I am asking you to look at the primary sources, the attendance sheet, the corporate registrations, the fine records, the dates, and then I am asking you to vote for what those documents require." I sat down. Carmen made her closing legal summary in under 4 minutes. The motion to rescind, the no confidence vote, what each would accomplish procedurally, what would happen next if both passed. Then she asked for the vote. Margaret spoke before the vote was called. She stood at the board table with her prepared remarks and delivered them in the same measured tone she had used in that conference room the first day, calm, professional, precise. She said the documents had been misrepresented. She said the vendor relationships were disclosed and appropriate. She said the guideline revisions had been conducted in good faith under her understanding of the bylaws. She said Daniel Reyes had waged a campaign of harassment against a volunteer leader who had given years of service to this community. She said all of it well. She was, I will give her this, an effective speaker. Then Carmen quietly stood and said, "One factual correction for the record. Mrs. Chen has stated the special session was held on a Thursday. The attendance sheet in her handwriting is dated a Wednesday. A small thing. A single day." Margaret looked at the sheet on the projected display. She looked at it for 2 full seconds. Then she looked away. She did not correct it. She did not explain it. She sat down and straightened her pen beside her laminated agenda and did not speak again. Gerald Foss, 3 rows back, looked at his hands. The vote was conducted by written ballot, collected and counted by 2 resident volunteers Carmen had designated in advance. Motion to rescind the architectural guideline revisions, 71% in favour. Vote of no confidence in the current board, 68% in favour. The board was dissolved pending election of an interim board. The HOA's new attorney advised on the record that given the civil suit and the state investigation, immediate rescission of all fines issued under the void guidelines was strongly recommended. The interim board would be elected at a follow-up meeting in 30 days. Margaret gathered her laminated agenda. She picked up her pen. She put both in her bag with the same precise movements she brought to everything, controlled, deliberate, giving nothing away. She walked out without looking at anyone. The room stayed loud for a long time after she left. I sat in my chair and looked at the folder in my lap. The original Form 14B stamped, notarized, 6 years old. The first thing I had put on Margaret Chen's conference room table the morning this all began, the document she had looked at and never once picked up. I thought about driving home. I thought about the fence, silver aluminum posts, wrong colour by Margaret's standard, exactly right by mine. I took out my phone and called Sophia. She picked up on the second ring and said, "Dad, it's 10 o'clock. What's wrong?" I said nothing. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to hear your voice." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Did you win?" I said, "Yeah." "I think we did." She said, "Good. Can we do pool day Saturday?" I said, "Absolutely." The morning after the vote, I woke up at 6, which is what I do every morning regardless of what happened the night before. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard. The fence was still there, silver aluminum posts catching the early light, same as they had for 6 years. Nothing about it had physically changed, but standing there looking at it felt different, the way a room feels different after you've cleaned it, not because anything moved, but because the weight of the mess is gone. I drank my coffee and let the quiet be quiet for a while. The formal outcomes came in stages over the following weeks, and Carmen walked me through each one as it arrived. The Arizona Department of Real Estate completed its investigation 34 days after the special membership meeting. The finding was formal and unambiguous: improper HOA management practices, specifically selective and retaliatory enforcement, procedurally defective rulemaking, and undisclosed conflicts of interest in vendor recommendation. Margaret Chen was barred from serving as an officer or board member of any HOA in the state of Arizona for 5 years. The finding was a matter of public record. Carmen sent me the document as a PDF attachment with no message. Just the file. I think she understood I didn't need commentary. Sunstate Fencing LLC was referred to the Arizona Registrar of Contractors for investigation of unlicensed referral practices, specifically the arrangement by which violation notices appeared to generate customer referrals to a company owned by the HOA president's son. That investigation was ongoing, but the referral itself was enough to effectively end Sunstate's work in the residential HOA market. Contractors talk. HOA management companies talk. The referral became its own consequence. Carver and Hollis, the law firm that had sent me the 2-page letter mentioning foreclosure over a pool fence, quietly settled with 2 households who had filed separate complaints about intimidation through legal correspondence. The terms were confidential. Carmen told me the number was not small. The interim board was elected 30 days after the membership meeting, as scheduled. Beta Nakamura ran. She won her seat with the highest vote total of any candidate, which surprised everyone except the people who had watched her carry a shoebox of organized records into a community fight and hand it to the right person at the right moment. She brought to the board the same qualities she had brought to 30 years of library work: patience, precision, and an absolute conviction that documentation was not bureaucracy, but protection. Marcus Webb ran and won as well. He showed up to his first board meeting with a printed copy of the CC&Rs and a highlighter, which I heard about from Bet afterward, and which made me genuinely happy. The new board's first official action was a full audit of every fine issued in the previous 24 months. Every household that had been improperly charged received a written notice of restitution, the amount owed to them, the timeline for payment, and a formal written acknowledgement that the fines had been issued under guidelines that were procedurally void and therefore legally unenforceable. 11 households received restitution notices. 9 of them responded. 2 did not. 1 had moved, 1 simply never replied. Of the 9 who responded, most said the same thing in different ways, that the money mattered less than the acknowledgement, that someone finally saying this was wrong, in writing, on official letterhead, was what they had needed. The Garcias were the ones I thought about most. Carmen reached out to them directly on behalf of the new board with a formal written apology and a restitution check covering the full $6,400 they had paid in fines over 8 months. The letter was 2 pages. The new board had asked me to review a draft of it before it was sent, and I had suggested one change: that it name specifically what had happened to them, not just acknowledge a process error, but say clearly, "You were targeted. What was done to you was wrong." We are sorry. They agreed to that language. It stayed in the final letter. The Garcias didn't return to Sycamore Ridge. I hadn't expected them to. But 3 weeks after the letter was sent, the new board received a reply. A single handwritten page from Miriam Garcia. She thanked the new board for the acknowledgement. She said Eduardo had read the letter twice. She said they had both wondered, in the months after selling their home, whether anyone would ever know what had happened to them. She was glad someone knew. She wished the community well. Bet read that letter at the next board meeting. Nobody said much afterward. Sometimes a thing just needs to be heard. My civil case against the HOA settled 4 weeks after the membership vote. The terms included full voiding of all fines assessed against my property, reimbursement of my legal fees, and a structured payment into a community restitution fund that the new board administered for affected households. I had not sued for a large number. Carmen had advised against it, not because we couldn't justify it, but because a punishing settlement would have come from the HOA's operating budget, meaning ultimately from the community itself. The people I was trying to help shouldn't pay for what Margaret had done to them. The settlement amount was fair. Carmen said so, and I trusted her judgment. Gerald Foss resigned from the board the week after the membership vote, citing personal reasons. He did not face legal consequences. His role had been enablement rather than orchestration, and proving knowing participation in a scheme is a different bar than proving the scheme existed. Carmen felt his public separation from Margaret at the final meeting had been deliberate self-protection, and she was probably right. I thought about him occasionally in the weeks after, not with anger exactly, with something more like tired recognition, the Gerald Fosses of the world, men who hold the binder and take the notes and tell themselves they're just doing administrative work, not understanding or not caring that the binder and the notes are what make the whole thing run. I didn't reach out to him. I had nothing to say. Sophia came for the weekend 6 weeks after it was all over. She was 17, finishing her junior year, already starting to look at college websites with the particular focused anxiety of someone who understands that a decision is coming. She threw her bag on the guest room bed, changed into her swimsuit in under 3 minutes, and was in the pool before I'd finished making lunch. I sat in the chair my father had helped me position, angled to catch the evening light, just like he'd suggested, and watched her swim. She did cannonballs for a while, which she had done since she was 7, and showed no signs of stopping. Then she floated on her back with her eyes closed, which she had started doing more recently in the way teenagers sometimes go still when they think nobody is watching and you can see for a moment who they're becoming. I thought about my dad, the Saturday he flew out from Tucson, the way he stood in the backyard with a cup of coffee and walked the perimeter slowly, asking questions about drainage and sun exposure and gate placement with the focused curiosity of a man who wanted to understand how things worked. He had been a civil engineer before he retired. He noticed things like post depth and hinge weight. We spent most of that Saturday just talking about the fence. 14 months later, he was gone. The fence had been there ever since. Wrong colour, by Margaret's standard. Exactly right, by mine. There is one more thing I did, after everything was resolved. Along the eastern edge of my pool area, where the fence line borders the HOA's common area green space, I had a short retaining wall built. It was Carmen's suggestion, technically. She had mentioned offhand during one of our early meetings that structural elements installed below grade didn't require HOA approval under Arizona law, provided they met county code, which mine did. I filed the county permit myself. I hired a local stonemason named Albert, who had been doing this work for 30 years and who spent 2 days laying a clean low wall in a warm Arizona sandstone that caught the late afternoon light the way my father would have liked. It was not a dramatic gesture. I didn't build it out of anger or as a statement. I built it because Carmen was right. It was mine to build, within my rights, on my property, and nobody could touch it. And because there is something clarifying about putting a permanent thing in the ground after a long fight, something that says, I know exactly where my rights begin and end, and I am at peace with both. Albert finished on a Friday afternoon. I paid him, thanked him, and stood there after he left looking at the wall for a while. It was beautiful, simple, solid, exactly what it was supposed to be. I went inside and made dinner. The neighborhood settled into something different after all of it. Not transformed, people still had their routines, their polite waves, their separate lives. But there was a change in the texture of things. The community listserv was restored under new board management. People actually used it, not for conflict, just for the ordinary exchanges of a neighbourhood that had remembered it was a neighbourhood. Lost dogs, borrowed tools, a note about the jasmine on the corner that was blooming early this year. Bet hosted a small gathering on her patio in late September. Nothing formal, just some of the people who had shown up, who had sent emails, who had stood in that community room on a Thursday night and voted. We ate food and sat outside as the evening cooled and talked about things that had nothing to do with HOAs. It was a good evening. Paul, my neighbour across the street, the one who had suggested I just replace the fence and move on, came over one afternoon to return a ladder he'd borrowed months earlier and stood on my driveway for a moment before leaving. He said he was glad things had worked out. He said he wished he'd understood sooner what was actually happening. I told him it was fine. I meant it. Some people see clearly from a distance. Others need to be standing close enough to read the document themselves. Paul was the second kind. Most people are. That's not a character flaw. That's just how it works. The fence was still silver. Sophia came back for Thanksgiving. We had pool day, even though it was November, because the Arizona sun doesn't particularly care what month it is, and neither did she. My father would have approved of all of it. The wall, the water, the afternoon light. I think he would have been proud. I want to tell you something before we close this out. I am not someone who enjoys conflict. I never was. I am a high school history teacher who coaches junior varsity soccer and has strong opinions about cast iron pans. I did not wake up the morning that orange notice appeared on my fence thinking, good, finally, a fight. I woke up confused, then worried, then, for a few nights in the middle of it, genuinely scared. The letter from Carver and Hollis with the word foreclosure in the second paragraph, I won't pretend that didn't keep me up. It did. I lay in the dark doing math I didn't want to do, running timelines I didn't want to run, thinking about Priya's voice saying Sophia's college fund is not to be touched. Fear is a reasonable response to being threatened. I want to say that clearly, because I think sometimes these stories get told in a way that makes the protagonist sound fearless, and that's not honest and it's not useful. I was afraid. I just decided that being afraid wasn't the same as being wrong. Here is what I actually learned. Not the legal lessons, Carmen can teach those better than I can, but the human ones. Read what you signed. I know it's long. I know the CC&Rs look like something designed to make you give up before you finish the first page. Read them anyway. The procedural requirements that saved my case, the quorum rules, the notice requirements, the comment period, were all in that document. Margaret counted on the fact that nobody reads it. She was right about almost everyone. She was wrong about me, but only because I was angry enough to finally sit down with it. Keep your documents. Every approval form, every permit, every stamped piece of paper. Mine was 6 years old, and it was still the most powerful thing in my folder. A notarized signature from 6 years ago does not expire just because someone tells you it does. Find your neighbors. I could not have done any of this alone. Bet's shoebox. Marcus's testimony. The 14 people who emailed me after I put a note card in their mailbox. Patricia Odom standing up without a microphone. Eduardo Garcia reading 2 pages in a steady voice from a kitchen table in a house that wasn't the one he'd chosen. Every single one of them mattered. The pattern is the proof, and the pattern only becomes visible when people are willing to compare notes. And finally, don't let anyone convince you that a small seat of power makes their paperwork more valid than yours. It doesn't. Your stamped, notarized Form 14B from 6 years ago is exactly as real as anything they slide across a conference table. The date on your document matters. The signature at the bottom matters. Don't let the performance of authority substitute for actual authority. They are not the same thing. The fence is still silver. I have never once considered changing it. I'm not going to. If you've been through something like this, a notice that felt wrong, a fine that came from nowhere, a rule that appeared the week after you said no to someone in a position of power, I want you to tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone. You are probably not the only one. The pattern is always the proof. And if you want more stories like this, real conflicts, real documents, real people who decided that being afraid wasn't the same as being wrong, subscribe. There are more of these. There are always more of these. The fence is still silver. It's not going anywhere.
Okay, so I just want to stick with this story for a second because honestly, it gets me every time this man built a fence that was approved. Permanent sign of no try 6 years ago, and one person sitting in a small HOA office with a laminate agenda and a small British smile decided that none of that mattered anymore. And the scary part is almost funny because that's how these things work. It's not dramatic at the first. It's just a fine noodle, then another one, then a letter from a law firm, then your neighbor are quickly suggestion. You just given the pressure. It's designed to feel bigger than it actually is, but what denial did. And this is the part I keep coming back to. He did not file with emotion. He filed with paper, date, signature, public records, the attendance sheet in her own handwriting. That's that's what I found. The whole thing down. No lawyer on day one. No shouting, just a man who decided to actually read the document. Everyone else ignored it. And that to me is the most important takeaway from this entire story. Read your document.